The House of Commons has adopted the throne speech without a formal vote.
A constitutional rights group is sounding the alarm that the Liberals' Strong Borders Act may undermine civil liberties and charter rights.
Manitoba's NDP government is launching a racially segregated grant program exclusively for Black-owned businesses. Hello Canada, it's Friday, June 6th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Clayton, DeMaine.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Despite early morning posturing from the NDP, the government's official reply to the throne speech was adopted in the House of Commons on Wednesday without a vote. The motion was instead adopted by unanimous consent or on division, meaning no recorded vote was held. The adoption does not require a vote in the Senate either. When a motion is adopted on division, it means the motion is passed without a formal recorded vote, with an acknowledgement from the Speaker that not all members agree. Some members may dissent, but the dissent is not formally recorded as individual votes. This typically occurs when the outcome of the motion is clear and a formal vote is deemed unnecessary to save time. The adoption came only hours after NDP interim leader Don Davies had promised to vote against the throne speech in the House of Commons, possibly triggering a snap election. Davies, who took over as the interim leader of the NDP after former leader Jagmeet Singh failed to be re-elected, and NDP House leader Alexandra Boulerice announced a media scrum ahead of question period on Wednesday. As the throne speech is a confidence motion, Davies' announcement meant the Liberals would otherwise require the support of either the Bloc or the Conservatives to avoid returning to another federal election. Davies said, quote, "Millions of Canadians don't have access to an affordable home, they don't have access to timely health care, and they don't have access to good family-sustaining jobs they need." In voicing his concerns over the throne speech, Davies was additionally critical of the absence of employment insurance, non-market housing, and specific needs for Indigenous Canadians. When pressed by reporters on whether his decision reflected that his party has already lost confidence in the Carney government, Davies evaded answering directly, only vaguely offering that, quote, "This throne speech is not a worker-centered throne speech." This seems to be a flex from the NDP. Probably the first time interim leader Don Davies has been able to get his name out, and his decision-making capacity. But ultimately, it didn't make any difference. This vote, as it went through the House of Commons on division, the outcome was obvious. And I think that's because the Bloc had indicated they were going to support the Liberal minority government in passing the vote on the throne speech. If we recall back right after the election, Yves-Francois Blanchet said that he's willing to prop up the Liberals for at least a year, and he wasn't looking to take down the minority Liberal government. So despite some of the conversation on social media, I think it was quite obvious that the Liberals would have passed this even if it did go to a recorded vote. But Clayton, can we expect this new NDP, or at least the NDP in their transition period before they get a new leader, to stand up to the Carney government in this parliamentary session, or will they continue to just posture as Jagmeet Singh did before?
Well, I think with this vote, no parties were likely to call another election so early. But if Canadians take the NDP at their word, they can expect to see the NDP to try to use the Liberal minority government to their advantage, as they did in the previous round of Parliament. As we can gather from Davies' recent comments, the NDP will continue to push for an expanded healthcare system, increased government spending, and the like. The NDP are a more likely partner for the Liberals than the Bloc, which was very critical of the Liberal platform during the last election, though it could go either way. With a confirmed minority government now, the Liberals will have to appeal to at least one opposition party in any given vote to get anything passed. I think what you said was correct in that posturing will be important for the NDP, who last election lost 18 seats and was only left with 7. The majority of people True North spoke to on the streets of places such as Toronto who decided to publicly support Mark Carney and the Liberals this election told us that they are typically NDP supporters. So the NDP will have to distinguish itself from the Liberals before the next election if it wants to regain official party status and have any hope of surviving. And what better way to do that than to publicly announce your opposition to a low stakes vote, which most parties are not ready to vote against because it would trigger another election. A prominent constitutional rights group is pushing back against the Carney government's new border security bill, arguing that it would grant authorities sweeping new powers over Canadians' privacy. The Canadian Constitution Foundation expressed its concerns about Bill C-2 granting authorities, quote, new powers that undermine privacy, due process, and trust in our democratic institutions. The proposed border security legislation tabled on Tuesday would allow authorities to intercept communications and access information without a court-approved warrant. Its stated goals are to secure the border, combat organized crime, crack down on fentanyl smuggling, and bolster the authorities' ability to fight against financial crimes. Executive director for the CCF told True North, quote, while Bill C-2 addresses some serious concerns from fentanyl trafficking to abuse of Canada's asylum system, there are several provisions that raise serious constitutional and civil liberties questions. She said one of the most concerning is the proposed change to the Canada Post Act, which would allow customs officers to open letter mail, something that has long been considered especially private. The legislation would also, quote, allow a justice or judge to authorize in a warrant a peace officer or public officer to make a request to a foreign entity that provides telecommunication services to the public to produce transmission data or subscriber information that is in its possession or control. In other words, the government would have warrantless access to the social media communications of Canadians. Additionally, Bill C-2 aims to set new limits on cash transactions over $10,000 to curtail money laundering, something Barron called a, quote, major red flag. The legislation also intends to implement a new act that would force nearly every organization offering electronic services to organize its users' data in such a way that it can easily be accessed by law. The legislation also intends to implement a new act that would force nearly every organization offering, quote, electronic services to organize its users' data in such a way that it can be easily accessed by law enforcement or intelligence agencies when required and approved. Barron noted that granting the government the ability to engage in, quote, warrantless sharing of personal financial information between police, government departments, and banks under anti-money laundering laws is perhaps the most troubling provision included in the bill. So, Cosmin, what the government purports to do with any given bill is often different than the results that come from that. In trying to curb cross-border narcotics trafficking, is the Carney government going too far in curbing civil liberties?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of things in this bill that I think a lot of people who were pro-immigration restrictionist, who wanted to see some checks introduced to things like international students applying for asylum, etc., would agree with. For example, this bill goes even further to close some of the loopholes with our refugee agreement with the United States called the Safe Third Country Agreement, and it ties up some of the loopholes that still remain to this day. Additionally, it puts caps on when people can file asylum claims. They can't file past a certain point of time that they've been in the country, especially if they have student or work permits. So there's a lot of agreeable things in this bill, but like the liberals so often do, they might include a few good ideas, but then they introduce these sweeping expansions of government powers that anybody who supports individual liberty or constitutional rights, freedom of expression in Canada would find untenable and unsupportable. And I think this is the case with this bill. And it might be because when the liberals eventually debate that, when the House of Commons eventually debates this bill, and the conservatives, rightly so, find problems with the bill, the liberals can then say, well, look, we've presented a plan to shore up border security, to address immigration, but the conservatives don't want it passed. And it really is a political trap in a sense. Provide a poison pill to the conservatives because the conservatives will realize that there are elements in this bill that are against either, conservative principles or their MPs disagree with or their base just simply cannot accept. And some of those elements you've addressed. Part of it is that the government wants to essentially have the power to order social media companies, electronic communication companies, purveyors of electronic communications to fork over data simply based on requests or suspicions that the government provides. And on X, I actually wrote a little bit of a post on this because there are some overlaps in this bill between what happened with the Freedom Convoy when the Liberals introduced the emergencies order under the Emergencies Act to clamp down and freeze the bank accounts of protesters and supporters. And specifically, they cited a law, a Canadian law that's already on the books called the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. And what this bill, the current Border Security Bill, C2, seeks to introduce is a whole new section to that bill, which authorizes banks and financial institutions to essentially blacklist anybody who the government deems undesirable without even telling the user of their service that they've been blacklisted. And all it takes, based on the way that this law is written, is for the RCMP, CSIS, or any relevant government agency to simply ask in writing and state that the purpose, according to them, is to detect money laundering, terrorist financing, or sanctions evasion. Now, all of that, well and good criminal activities, but we know that those laws were applied to the Freedom Convoy when there is a vast amount of evidence showing that none of that applied. There was no terrorist financing of the Freedom Convoy. There was no, foreign money was insignificant. Most of the money originated in Canada. So they use these same unfounded excuses back then. You can only imagine what they would do if it's already on the books and they can't cite, a temporary emergency power to do this, but they can do this perpetually. And I'll just add, they don't even need a conviction to make this request. They don't need a terrorism peace bond on you or anything. It's just simply a written request from the government suspecting that any individual might be involved in these things based on how they define it, and the bank has to oblige. Manitoba's NDP government is launching a taxpayer-funded business grant program exclusively for entrepreneurs who identify as Black. The provincial government, in collaboration with the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce, announced that they are now accepting applications for entrepreneurs and business owners who run Black-owned and Black-led businesses. Those who are not Black are ineligible for funding. The province is offering Black businesses a grant between $5,000 and $20,000 in an effort to help Black Manitobans, quote, address the realities, barriers, and opportunities specific to Black entrepreneurs and business owners in Manitoba. Manitoba's Minister for Business, Mining, Trade, and Job Creation, Jamie Moses, said, quote, our government is proud to work with the Black business community in Manitoba to create good jobs and grow our economy. This program will help Black-owned and Black-led small businesses in Manitoba overcome systemic barriers and grow successful businesses in Manitoba. The grant application form requires the applicant to declare that the organization is Black-owned or Black-led, though it is not clear how the Chamber of Commerce and the government will be validating the claims. Manitoba's NDP government follows a trend of governments providing specific racial and ethnic groups with exclusive government benefits inaccessible by non-minorities or minorities excluded from consideration. 2020, the Trudeau government created a multi-million-dollar loan program exclusively for Black entrepreneurs, offering Black businesses with loans up to $250,000. This sort of a race-based government funding programs or incentives, etc., seems to be commonplace, and virtually there is no resistance, there is no legal challenge or court fight back against this. So, Clayton, why are provincial governments going this way, providing these race ethnic based benefits instead of providing equal opportunities to everyone and making entrepreneurship accessible at a larger scale?
Yeah, Cosmin, it really just highlights the ideological drive of identity politics in the Western world in general right now. It stems from the idea that some groups have been historically and disproportionately given opportunities in the past, and it's built in a way to give back to those groups. Although groups are made of individuals, it also stems from this approach of actually having a way with the liberal concept of equality of opportunity that you brought up. That doesn't matter anymore to the institutions. Instead, you will hear the term equity over equality. Supporters of equity mean that everyone shouldn't have access to the same opportunities, but everyone should be granted enough support based on their needs. And if you thought that sounds an awful lot like the Marxist phrase, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, you wouldn't be alone, though most followers of this ideology might not explicitly say that. You have plenty of conservatives on platforms like X and critics of the new woke religion of the state who point out that this is simply neo-Marxism. It props up groups from a collectivist perspective as either being oppressors or oppressed. Other critics of these racially discriminative practices will note that many people who aren't labeled as equity deserving by these programs are often left out of the support simply because their skin color, gender, or sexual preferences don't match the equity group that the policy is trying to serve. One thing is for sure, though, it's a complete departure from Martin Luther King's vision of a society where everyone is treated based on their character rather than identifiable characteristics.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.